Set. Welcome to Sabbath Collective. We're a community of people interested in celebrating the Sabbath and pursuing God and our times through an ancient Hebraic worldview of Scripture. And tonight we're going to get into an interesting topic, holding on to realistic hope. So I am a bit of a realist, and you can give me a thumbs up if you are as well. I am a realist who is a person of faith. I have hope, but I accept what I see as a present reality. Even though I do believe that this reality can change, I still accept that this present reality exists. I identify myself as someone who seeks to engage with the world and humanity as they really are and as they can be. Some people would simply kind of say, well, you're either a pessimist or an optimist, and I really disagree with that assessment. A realist does not have to be a pessimist. A pessimist says, I see things that are bad, and I believe they never will change. So that's a realist, that's a pessimist. In fact, I personally view myself as an optimistic realist. I see things in reality that are not ideal and maybe not great. To change them, however, you have got to see them as they really are. And once again, the difference in Western Greek thinking, that's places like the US, which have an either or, so they think it either has to be this way or this way, and a destination event. In other words, when we're here, when we arrive, it's a place, it's an event. This is Western Greek thinking, as opposed to Eastern Hebraic thinking, which is both and. So we can see things that are not good, but we can also have hope that we can change things. So it's both and, as well as a journey and a process. I actually believe Yeshua was a bit of a realist as well. As a realist, he taught people God's perfect code or laws of how to live in the world and with other people. He taught them what behaviors are healthy for them, healthy for others, and connect them even closer with God. And he said in Luke 6:27 through 28, nevertheless, to you who are listening, what I say is this: love your enemies. Again, love your enemies. This is a realist. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. Now, wow, that, I don't know about you, but that seems like it's a bit of from a realist perspective to me, right? Hey, Sissy, good to have you with us. Hey, Phoebe and Callie, good to have you with us. The beach is a happy place. For me too, Evelyn. So what does this text actually imply? It implies Jesus is saying you will have enemies. You will have people who hate you. You will have people who curse you and mistreat you. And when they do, here's how you handle it. Scott Sauls, in his book, Jesus Outside the Lines, writes this: Jesus, the sympathetic realist, reminds us that everything is broken. At least it is for now. I love that. He calls him a sympathetic realist. Now, there can be bad, but you can do good. And that is a realistic hope that we can have. So when Yeshua began teaching his Talmudim, that's the Hebrew word for disciples, he begins with the realization he wants all of them to wrap their brains around the fact that you are not perfect. Okay? And a lot of people feel that he was doing that because he was trying to expose sin in his disciples. And I actually think that it was for an even bigger reason. And again, it doesn't have to be the only reason, but it's a bigger reason. That when they could see themselves as not perfect, seeing that actually helps us to deal with the imperfection in others. And so it would be a very good thing for the followers of Yeshua to see themselves as imperfect. He was always turning people's attentions to their own shortcomings so that they would accept others. In John 8:7, he says to a crowd that's ready to stone a woman who was caught in the act of adultery. Don't even get me started about where the dude was, right? But it was her. It was by herself. They wanted to stone her. And he bends down and he writes in the sand. And he says this when they're ready to kill her. When they kept questioning him, John 8:7 says, he straightened up and said to them, "The one of you who is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Now imagine this is the teacher saying this while he's maybe writing, the very things that they're struggling with. And in his prayer, he asked us to think of our own failures in order to be able to forgive others. So he says, it's recorded in Matthew 6:12, "Forgive us what we have done wrong." This is in his prayer. He's teaching us how to pray, "as we too have forgiven those who have wronged us." So it's a really interesting thing to notice that Yeshua was oftentimes sort of lifting into the awareness of his followers the fact that they are not perfect. And he was a realist with this, right? Even though at the same time, he saw those people as what they could be. And when we realize that we fall short, we're not perfect, it gives us, of course, grace for others. We're not perfect in our love. We sometimes even hurt those that we love the most. Yeshua is behaving like a hopeful realist. And when Peter, another example, asks him a question about forgiveness, we read in Matthew 18, verses 21 and 22, it says, "Then Kepha," that was the Aramaic name for Peter, "came up and said to him, 'Rabbi, how often can my brother sin against me and I have to forgive him? As many as 7 times?' 'No, not 7 times,' answers Yeshua, 'but 70 times 7. And we're all very familiar with this text, obviously. But this is a Hebraic teaching moment which looks at the circular concept of the way Hebraic teaching is and Hebraic literature is. It's a circular concept instead of a linear literalism. Okay? Again, Hebraic thinking and relating to Scripture and even the way we see Jesus teaching, a circular concept instead of that Greek Western thinking, which is a linear literalism. Straight line, right? Realism can hurt. And Yeshua was saying that this concept is that you never stop forgiving others because you never stop needing forgiveness yourself. So commonly we avoid or run from reality. Now, how many people, honestly, you can give me a thumbs up, you could say this is me, have a really hard time connecting to reality? Now, I don't mean that you're like a delusional, schizophrenic type of person. I mean that you just have a really hard time, and the closer it is, the harder it is, seeing things as they really are. Whether it's in yourself, maybe it's in your kids, maybe it's with your partners, maybe it's in the business that you're starting, maybe it's in the career, maybe it's in our country, whatever it is. You feel like I always shy away when I feel like I have to see something that I don't like. Give me a thumbs up with that if you're feeling that. Again, a lot of us run from reality, especially when it comes to ourselves. We prefer to think about ourselves as the heroes of our own stories, right? Peter also thinks of himself as a hero during the Passover Seder, where Yeshua says this. And while Yeshua, the hopeful realist, sees the reality of what's about to happen, and he prepares him for it. Again, because This is what God does. And we read about that in Matthew 26, verses 33 through 35. He says, I will never lose faith in you, Kepha answered, even if everyone else does. So this is, again, Peter saying to Jesus, there's no way I'm going to bail on you. I'm your boy. I got your back, right? And Yeshua said to him, yes, I tell you that tonight, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Even if I must die with you, Kepha replied, I will never disown you. And all the Talmudim said the same thing. So again, this is unrealistic, hopeful Peter, okay, talking to a realistic, hopeful Savior. And we can see the difference with how they relate to what's about to happen. Life will eventually show a person as they really are, realistically, not as they romantically dream themselves to be. And oftentimes he uses those closest to us to do that. The Apostle Peter discovers the not so heroic truth about himself after Yeshua is arrested, and I think most of you know the story, where he does exactly what Jesus said he was going to do. But what Yeshua said he would, when the rooster crows, you will have disowned me 3 times. But Yeshua still had a realistic hope, because he was leaving his message with all the people that were about to run and deny him. Many times we are so avoidant of reality about ourselves, about others, about the world, that we practice denial and distraction. Now, I'm not speaking of practices such as meditation or envisioning that refocus us, that sort of disconnect from the distraction and go inward, focus on God, focus on whatever, a word, a vision, whatever you do, or you envision something that you want to see in your life. That's a refocus, or where you focus and feel in a dream that is not yet manifested. That's not what I'm talking about when I talk about an unrealistic hope, okay? This is something that you have a hope, a faith in, even though it hasn't manifested yet. That's fine. I'm talking about an unrealistic hope, okay? Let's drill down a little bit deeper, okay? Aaron is saying, Evelyn says, sometimes it hurts to see things as they are. Absolutely. And it's easier to look the other way. Always, right? Truth is truth. And it takes courage to look at it, for sure. Aaron says, sometimes I feel like this is what I'm doing when I have to take a break from social media or the news. I'm scared I'm shying away from reality. Then current events get too much. I don't think that that's the same, Aaron. I think that you're giving yourself a health break. I do the same thing all the time, right? And that's when it gets too much, when it gets too real, you have to take a break and kind of realize how you're going to interact with these things in the world. You're actually not disconnecting from the reality of what is. The reality of what is so painful that you have to take a break in order to kind of get your strength back. So you're actually fully connected, fully realistic, but you're inundated with the pain of it, okay? So that's kind of the opposite of disconnecting. So I hope that answers your question, Aaron. So I knew a young man in New York that bought a restaurant bar. Let me give you an example of what realistic hope is, okay? He bought a bar in New York, young guy in his 30s, a restaurant bar, and he envisioned that he was going to be the popular local hangout place. This was in a place in Brooklyn. And that all the community would come, they would hang out, they would celebrate there when somebody's sports team won or their kid played a game or whatever it was, that they would come to this local place. And it had a real kind of checkered history. So he was having to rebuild trust and get, the community to come in. In the meantime, he couldn't pay the bills. He could not pay the bills, okay? But he really had a vision for this place, and he did a lot of research. He went into it informed. He went into it with a plan, but the people weren't as quick to come in as what he had hoped, so he couldn't pay the bills. So he didn't lose his vision of what he hoped for, but he realized, I got to pay the bills and I got to pay my staff, so I'm going to work the early hours of the day so that I can pay my own bills and supplement with what's not getting paid in the restaurant. Okay? He envisioned the day he believed everything would happen that he had hopes and dreams for, but he also knew he had to get another job to pay his bills. So that's realistic hope. And then, by the way, you keep analyzing, you kind of keep checking in with that realistic hope, right? To make sure that you're still feeling good about it. So when I speak of envisioning, I'm not talking about denial, okay? This young man was very connected to reality. Denial happens most often in those that avoid realism. So denial would look like a guy that wouldn't go to work to pay the bills at all because he was just waiting for something to happen for his vision to be fulfilled. That's unrealistic hope. Let me give you an example of unrealistic hope. So we have an example of realistic hope. Let me give you an example of unrealistic hope. Okay, I knew a pastor who was a young man in his 30s, and he was one of those hipster pastors, right? And he had all the technology happening in the church, and he dressed with all the stuff, and you know, he was like your typical hipster young 30-something-year-old. This was about 10 years or so I knew him. And what happened is he had a vision for a church in the town that he was in, and he had a vision that this would be a big structure, a big building, that the church would meet in a big structure, and that they would do all kinds of things. They would do things for youth, and they would do things for family, just all kinds of things, all kinds of life would be around this big structure that the church would come to, right? He had what he used to call, and I remember he used to say this all the time to me, he had a God-sized dream and a hope that it was happening. So he called it a God-sized dream because he used to say to me, only God can make this happen. Well, he talked a banker into loaning him money, and he started building this big structure. And of course, he and all the people that thought like him said, praise God, that was the Lord. That's how you got that money. And so they started building this big structure. But the thing was, there was a company at the time, the whole time he was saying this, the whole time he was planning this, there was a company that the majority of the people in this town worked for, and they were mostly in their 30s and 40s. And it was a kind of tech kind of thing. And most of the people in this area worked at this company, but this company was pulling up stakes and moving to another place. And everybody knew they were moving. And everybody knew all these young people that were more in line with who this young pastor was were going to move with the company, right? And eventually that's what happened. Leaving only older, like my age, 50s, 60s, older blue collar crowd that worked in a food factory. Okay? Now, here was this young hipster pastor, and there was a disconnect with what was going on here. He had this vision, but how is this vision realistic? How was it ever going to happen? Who was going to come to this building to see a hipster kid in tight jeans and a funky haircut when you're a blue-collar 60-year-old food factory worker? I mean, I know sometimes people, but I'm just saying normally, right? And all the people that were his target demographic moved. And he knew they were going to move. So this was not a healthy hope. Do you see the difference here between an unrealistic hope and a realistic hope? The restaurant bar owner, realistic hope. And by the way, he did get his community restaurant bar. The pastor, unrealistic hope. Okay? This was, again, not healthy. And it was more like a hyper desire that he had, rooted firmly in denial. I'm going to say that one more time. The pastor had a hyper desire that was rooted firmly in denial. We don't want to live there, okay? We don't want a hyper desire rooted firmly in denial, okay? Oftentimes when someone lives in denial, the avoidant behaviors do serious harm. In other words, we hurt ourselves when we live in this state of constant desire, right? It hurts us. Eventually we can get angry, or we can get resentful. We can sort of act out because we know it's not happening, but we don't know why. And so we start to blame people for it, right? Which is what we humans often do. And again, people do all kinds of things to distract themselves from seeing reality. And these behaviors further separate us from our own hearts, from others, and from any real sense of hope. I know somebody recently who just sort of sabotaged his job so he would get fired. He sort of did it on purpose, subconsciously on purpose, who knows how much, because the job was so unhealthy for him. And when I was talking to him about it, I said, you did these things, you kind of knew how this was going to play out, right? I mean, this was taking you down the road. While he was in the job, the money that he was getting was so good that he disconnected from his true self. And he just thought, well, I could handle it. But it was an unrealistic hope, because he was grieving his own integrity. And we can't stay in that place. Let me see your comments. No bueno. Yeah, exactly. Is it different that unrealistic hope relies a little too much on miracles? Okay, I'm glad you brought that up, because in no way, obviously this is not an either or thing. In no way am I negating the miracles. So let me just give you this quick story. You've heard me tell this before, but it's a true story, and it really kind of gives you the perfect balance of realistic hope, but not being in denial. So our family, my husband and I, felt like we were called to Brooklyn to work at a ministry there, and we moved our two little boys up there, and my oldest child was about 3, and 3.5, and my youngest child was about 1. And so we moved to Brooklyn. So we go into the house, we move into Brooklyn, we start the ministry, we leave everything that we have in South Jersey and move there. And I mean, we're all in, like there's no turning back. We didn't have anything to go back to, right? We started the ministry, things were really going good. I take my kids for a checkup at the doctor's, and they have off the charts lead poisoning. And the doctor is like, you have to give me what apartment number you're staying in right now, and I have to call the EPA because your kids are getting poisoned. And I'm like, what the heck? We just moved here. We left everything. We felt like this was a calling for us, and now our kids are getting poisoning, and there's no place else we can go. Like, we lived in staff housing. Okay, we lived for free in staff housing that the ministry owned. So it wasn't like we had another apartment we could go to. So I came home and I just began to pray, and I'm like, God, this isn't cool. You have to do something. So I told the doctor when I left the office, I said, look, we were in other places. Maybe it came from somewhere else. Let's retest in a couple weeks. And he said, okay, but I'm only giving you that amount, and then I'm going to call. So we go home, I pray and pray and pray and pray, and I take the kids back, and I pray in their room, and I take the kids back, and the doctor says it must have been some sort of mistake. Maybe the test was faulty or something, because your kids are fine. So we lived in that room there that the kids lived in for like that particular apartment for like 8.5 years. Kids were always fine. No lead problems. Everything's fine, right? We move out Another family moves in. They had 5 kids. Within a month, all the kids had lead poisoning. True story. All the 5 kids had lead poisoning. They had to come in, they had to remediate in the building and the whole deal. Now, what happened was, God, obviously, Aaron did a miracle, right? And the wall, we found out where the lead was after this other family moved in, because I heard from the staff. It was in the very wall that my kids had their headboards on in their bunk beds. So every night when my kids went to sleep, there was some kind of supernatural barrier that protected them from lead that was in the wall. Every single night for 8.5 years. And as soon as we left, it went back to the reality of what it really was. However, so I had hope. However, if I took my kids back and they still tested positive for lead, Aaron, I would not have gone back in that apartment and just said, oh, it's going to be okay. Everything's going to be fine. I would have done something else. So we need to allow for miracles. I have a cool quote about that in a little bit. But we also need to be realistic. I hope that was a good example. We need to cultivate a realistic hope. Realistic hope is not based on the perspective that everything was, is, or will be fine. To the contrary, hope is about a perspective with real, specific possibilities that ignite and shape our visions and call us to action. Okay, so hope in the dark. This is the quote I was talking about. Hope in the Dark by Rebecca Salnett. She writes, hope is not a sunny, everything is getting better narrative, though it may be a counter to the everything is getting worse narrative. Okay, again, so you're not a pessimist because you're a realist with hope, right? So let's just read that one more time. Hope is not a sunny, everything is getting better narrative, though it may be a counter to the everything is getting worse narrative. You could call it an account of complexities and uncertainties with openings. Whoo, that's so good. Read that last sentence one more time. You could call it an account of complexities and uncertainties with openings. So what happens is when we have a realistic hope, we make room for miracles, but we are realistic in that. Unrealistic optimism is false hope. It's not based on any kind of thinking. To be sure, there are benefits of being optimistic, but optimism without any real basis or plan to support it is completely hollow. It's not the same as realistic hope. If you've ever talked to someone who wanted something and you say, well, so what are you doing to work on that? How's that going to get I don't know. It's just going to happen. I just know it will. I just know one day it will. It's hollow. It is the person who puts a skinny picture of themselves on the refrigerator and looks and says, that's going to be me every time they open that door to drink a beer or eat a piece of pie, right? It's false hope. And it's not clearly linked to realistic planning and action. Hopeful people recognize uncertainty, okay? They think of new pathways around obstacles, and they act. Hopeful people understand that what they do matters. Sometimes even if they do not know how it will matter or for whom it will matter, but they know somehow it matters. That's a hopeful realist. I was speaking to someone recently who had a relationship issue, a pretty serious one. And I asked them, well, when are you going to talk to your partner? When are you going to talk to them about this? And they said, oh, I did, pretty much. That's not talking. That's unrealistic hope. That's a disconnection from reality that things will somehow just change. Some people keep ignoring the serious issues and just believe it will fix itself with no communication or no plan, no accountability, no measurements. and that is a complete disconnection. Viktor Frankl, an existential psychiatrist, and you've heard me quote him a lot, he survived a Nazi concentration camp. He describes despair as meaningless suffering, and he created a kind of formula to identify it. He called it D equals S minus M. Despair equals suffering without meaning. Despair equals suffering without meaning. Finding meaning, what he's saying, arrests despair. Finding meaning can give the whole thing purpose. Like Carl Jung said, we cannot change anything unless we accept it. We cannot change anything unless we accept it. And this is the difference between an unrealistic person and a realistic person as it relates to hope. We need to see the problems. We need to take steps to change the behaviors or the situations that are the problems. Or we need to take steps to live with the problems if it's going to work in a healthy way, which is, Aaron, that's what you were talking about with disconnecting sometimes. You're still engaged with what's going on, but you need times of disconnection you need to push pause to be healthy, really. Can you give a clear distinction between hope and faith in this context? I feel like the terms have been pretty interchangeable in the church world, and I can't tell if faith can be viewed in this context as well. Yes, faith and hope are very much interchangeable, and there's different Hebrew words for faith and hope. And hope is that you have a hope that something will happen, and oftentimes they work together. Faith is more about that you have faith that it will happen, and that faith is usually based in something. So either it's God who's going to do a miracle, or you have faith in the system that you're building that you feel like is so reliable that you can stand on it. It's going to work. You're going to be able to be secure. So you have faith in a thing. Okay, this is a simplistic difference. There's a whole word study, but you have faith in the thing, in a thing, in a person, in a way. You have hope as you envision the thing. Does that make sense? It's a little bit nuanced and off the cuff. That's my explanation. So again, this can create meaning, okay? If we are ignoring or denying what's happening, we are cutting off from our true selves. So hey Evangelina, good to see you. So let's cultivate realistic hope. Psychologists often speak of the power of the will, your will, and I should do both places, and the way. So your willpower is a key player in realistic hope. It is your driving force. It is your energy that will move you towards what you are realistically hoping for. So that's your willpower, right? Your way power is the road you will take. It's your plans, okay? It's what will lead you there. It's the vehicle that you're in, so to speak. Your way power allows you to adapt and adjust. It's fluid, but it's moving. So you have the power of the will and you have the power of the way. And both those things are very connected to realistic hope. Realistically, hopeful people see the problems or see what they want to have in their life. Maybe it's not connected to a problem at all. They recognize the challenges, but they know their hearts. They have their own visions, and they are present in reality, and they act. They don't just wait, they act. They commit to acting over and over again. So, the will, the way, and we're going to act with realistic hope. We're going to close this time with the lighting of the Shabbos candles, and traditionally the mothers of the home light the Sabbath candles, which remind us and connect us to the light of peace and joy and unity. And then the tradition is she encircles the candles with her hands 3 times, which is a gesture that welcomes in the Sabbath. The Lord is our light and our salvation. May his light be felt in us and through us as the enlightenment of truth and the radiance of joy. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.